So this will be Exodus Part 2. And if we did every verse like we did Galatians, we would retire. Last week we did a flyover of Exodus and saw that its relation to other books and its purpose. And this week we're going to be in Exodus chapter 1, and we're going to be dealing with the birth and education of Moses. And you remember the name of this book, really, the Greek give it the name Exodus. It's really, now these are the names, was the Hebrew name of this book. So, chapter 1 and verse 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. So, going to kind of give you a little bit of history. So they came into Egypt. You know, when I was little, I wanted to be an archaeologist. I love the study of archaeology. And King Tut, you remember back in the 70s, early 70s, I think, when they finally found his tomb or whatever, I was amazed. And I mean, that was it. And I had no idea of Egypt, and all I knew was the pyramids and the Sphinx, so I just poured over that. I loved that study. And it almost seems like when we read Bible stories that they're removed from history, like there's something that, I was talking to Tracy the other day. She was like how much she enjoyed the Birth of Jesus series, and I've got one more to do on that. And she said, I just never thought of it. I just think of it as the movie, and this happened. I just can't picture somebody bumping into Mary carrying a little baby while they're going up to the temple and her purification for it. You just never think about those things. And, it's almost like the baby glowed or something at everybody, but it didn't. They didn't know who it was. It was just a little common smelly baby. So when I look at Egypt here, I want you to understand it was the most advanced of the ancient civilizations. Egypt was. I mean, that was, if we could bring it into modern society, Egypt was the United States of the day. And Israel came in to Egypt as free people. They willingly came to Egypt. And they were welcomed there by Pharaoh, by the then reigning Pharaoh. And the reason he welcomed them was because of Joseph. Remember the 7-year famine and all of that. So Israel, these 70, they've come here, they've multiplied, they've filled the land. And they come to a nation that abounded in art and literature and architecture and science. The Egyptians weren't ignorant. They weren't ignorant cave dwellers, savages that wrote on walls. Look, there are people today who believe that the Egyptians were so advanced that their education had to come from aliens. I mean, they make movies. I mean, they would tell you there's no way that they could line up the pyramids the way they did to exactly line up with the belt of Orion. No way they could do that. So that, I mean, this is how advanced it was. So here we got these shepherds coming into the supreme culture. I mean, and I want you to get this, when they come into the land, Egypt had just built the Great Pyramids. Okay? They had just built them. I mean, when I say just built them, the pyramids were being built about the same time as Abraham. Okay? While Abraham's over here in Canaan, Egypt's building pyramids. Pyramids that are still there today. That's amazing. And when Israel, Jacob and his sons came into Egypt, the place was dotted with little pyramids and sphinxes and monuments, great tombstones. It was a magnificent country. And you know, it was the most advanced kind of civilization. However, it was degraded. It was a miserable country in the sense, for all the wealth of that country was in the hands of the priest. Egypt had priests. And Pharaoh was the supreme priest of all priests. He was a member of that priesthood. So Pharaoh and the priest had all the money. I mean, by the time I get done describing all this, you're going to think Egypt is the United States. Because isn't it something that all the wealth is in the hands of a few? They're not priests, but they're businessmen. You know, I've heard people say, you know, 10 people's got 80% of all the money. I'm not one of the 10. So all the Egyptians, all the people in Egypt were slaves to Pharaoh. Now, what I mean slaves to Pharaoh, they weren't in chains or none of that. But we could say in the sense of China, North Korea, Russia. You know what I mean? So if Pharaoh had an idea, all the people had to participate. Whatever program he wanted to bring about, there it come. I mean, you know, there was no... They had all the money, this is what they was going to do. I mean, the Egyptians had their own lives, but they were in possession of Pharaoh. And you know, the Egyptians worshipped all kinds of gods. And they had symbols for them, you know, birds and fish. And they worshipped animals. I mean, you can see the pictures. You ever see the pictures where it's a man's body and legs, but the head of a bird, or the head of a dog or something, you know? And Pharaoh looked upon himself and was looked upon by the people as a god. I mean, they were the royal family. They were the family supposedly that came from heaven. And you know, Romans 1:23 says they worship the creature more than the creator. And they took to themselves creeping things and crawling things. He's going all the way back to Egypt. I mean, that was the story of Egypt. So the misery of being a slave to Pharaoh in that sense, plus their religion, it produced a very immoral nation. Very immoral. All this sounds very familiar, don't it? And that's what Israel came into. Now you know that they didn't settle in main Egypt. They settled in Goshen. And Goshen was was the rich land. It was near the Nile River. Matter of fact, the Pharaohs lived there. Most of Egypt was a dust bowl, but not Goshen. It was a rich land. Let me show you this scripture. I should have wrote these down, but I didn't. Numbers 11 and 5. Listen to what it says. We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt. Because they made all these little canals, and they live right there. You just put your hand in the water and drag out fish. We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt. We did eat in Egypt freely. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. I mean, we're talking onions and garlic. It's not something you go eat like an apple. These are the spices that they use. I mean, they had spices. See, we just take it for granted. You think when they got in the wilderness, they didn't have any spices for the food. But here they could decorate it up. And in Deuteronomy 11 and 10, it says, for the land whither thou goest in to possess it, it's not as the land of Egypt. The land I'm sending you to is not like Egypt. Now remember Egypt? Fish, water, leeks, melons. It's not like the land of Egypt from which you came out, where thou sowest thy seed and waterest it with thy foot as the garden of herbs. Now what he means is, now remember, most of Egypt's a dust bowl, but they're right on the fertile grounds, and all these little canals and stuff flowed off. So that's what they did. They had to get the water from the river Nile to their garden. So they made a little treadmill, and they operated it with their foot, a little wheel to push the water over there so they could water the garden. Remember, if there was no rain, it was a dust bowl. The river Nile was their only source of water. So they watered it with their foot. I'm just giving you the practical side. Long story short, Israel enjoyed Egypt. They enjoyed it. They longed to go back. I mean, you got to think about that. Egypt to them was a good land, man. We had everything we wanted down there. I mean, he says a garden of herbs. I mean, could you imagine just go out there and grow your cucumbers? I mean, this is great. We've been living out there as shepherds all our life, and now we got one house, not living in a tent anymore. It's not too bad. Got my own business set up, They lived right among the Egyptians, right in Goshen. And the scripture says that there it was that they multiplied. They were so much a part of the Egyptians, you couldn't tell the difference. Now think about this. When they came down there, they couldn't even recognize Joseph. Joseph's a Hebrew. They didn't know who he was. He was so much an Egyptian. Looked like him, dressed like him, smelled like him, talked like him. Israel became so much like the Egyptians that when the death angel came on Passover, he couldn't tell a Hebrew from an Egyptian. The only way he could tell was the blood on the door. Isn't that something? And here we go. So when Israel came into Egypt, they were shepherds. You remember the shepherds to the Egyptians was an abomination. But when they got to Egypt, apparently they gave it up for the most part. No need to be a shepherd in Egypt. When they came out of Egypt, we're jumping way forward, we only read of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh continued on to be shepherds. The rest, they left and learned Egyptian culture, Egyptian civilization. They learned math and science and art and crafting and sculpting. And I know you think that's crazy, but they did. So much so, and see, this is how God uses everything. How else would they learn to smelt the gold and the silver for the tabernacle that they were going to make in the wilderness? How else were they going to learn to sew the beautiful embroidery on the veil? They learned all those crafts right here in Egypt. You see, and God was going to use every bit of that right over here. They learned writing. You know, Moses was the first one to write the Scriptures. Where do you think they learned to write at? They learned to write in Egypt. Abraham didn't write. They sat around the fire and told stories. You know, I mean, that's how they did it. There was different languages in Egypt. There was 3 major languages. I can't remember what all there was, but not all Israel learned those languages, but they were there. So Israel moved from being shepherds, nomads, to being a civilized, settled down people living in Goshen. And unfortunately, the faith that had been brought about through Abraham, which was faith in God, that they had learned, that they had heard, slowly became just a shadow. Not much left of it. Not much need for it. You got everything you want, right? Isn't that the way it all is? Not much need for it. And when there's not much need for it, then there becomes room. So what they began to do was incorporate the idolatry of Egypt right in with their everyday life. All these other gods. Now they did continue to circumcise their children. We know that was given by Abraham, given by God to Abraham. They still continued to do that. They still knew there was a need to sacrifice to God. I mean, that was the first word that came to Pharaoh: let my people go that they might go out and sacrifice to me. They knew that. I mean, they knew of a bloodshed and sacrifice to be right with God. That they retained. And also, they retained the Sabbath. I know you're thinking, wait a minute. The Sabbath was one of the 10 Commandments. But go look at the wording. It says, thou shalt remember the Sabbath. God didn't say thou shalt keep the Sabbath as if I'm going to instill something new here, right? He said remember. So remember, they already knew about the Sabbath. Not in the details that would later come on, but they had some, you know what I mean? They had some revelation of those things. So that Sabbath was there. So these 3 things were the mark of covenant people: circumcision, sacrifice, and Sabbath. But they were grossly defiled by the idols. Let me go to Ezekiel. I'll show you. Ezekiel chapter 20. Verses 7 and 8. Then said I unto them, cast ye away every man the abomination of his eyes, and defile not yourselves with the idols of Egypt. For I am the Lord your God. But they rebelled against me, and would not hearken unto me. And they did not every man cast away the abomination of their eyes, neither did they forsake the idols of Egypt. Then I said, I will pour out my fury upon them, to accomplish my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. You remember, we ain't got there yet, but in Exodus 32, they made a golden calf. That golden calf was a god in Egypt. It was the god, Egyptian god, Minervus. They just changed its name from Minervus to the Lord our God. They worshipped They included astrology into their worship. Now, I know we think, oh, we're not into astrology. How many people read a stupid horoscope? Oh, what's the Lord got for me today? Hey, I wouldn't know I was an Aries if it wasn't for horoscopes. So when I'm down and out, I'm wanting a word of encouragement. I'm not reading the gospel. I'm getting the paper, going to my daily horoscope. I did it. Oh, today thou shalt meet somebody new and have a great day. All right. I read the text for a long time, and I always thought to myself, I never read one that said, you know what, today you're going to be in a car wreck, stay home. No, it was all,
Good stuff.
Look, here in Deuteronomy again, Deuteronomy 32, verse 17. They sacrificed unto devils. That word devils there is goats. Not to God, to gods whom they knew not, to gods that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not. Amos 5 and 6. But seek not Bethel nor enter Gilgal. That's not it. 5 and 26. Can't read my own writing. But ye have borne the tabernacle of your Moloch, and hewn your images, the star of your God, which ye made to yourselves. So they just began to subtly incorporate all these things right into their sacrifice and circumcision, astrology, stars. It seems good. They dragged all that filth with them when they came out of Egypt. All of that filth was there with Israel. And I just want you to get that picture, what we got going on here. What they came into. And they were fruitful. And they multiplied right there in Egypt. They were having a good life. And they were free in Egypt at this time. They governed themselves at this time. Now, how did they go about governing themselves? While obeying the rules of Egypt. Now, you can search all this stuff out. I got a couple of scriptures, but I want you to get an idea of how they governed themselves. We know there were 12 tribes, 12 families that came down there. And these became large families. Thousands upon thousands of them. So they would have a head of each tribe. At the head of each tribe was the elder. So you would have 12 elders. And the elder was the prince. I could say it this way, a word that we might understand in our word. He was the sheik. Right? He was the sheik, the prince. He was the lord of the tribe. Directly under the elder, the 12 chiefs, the 12 princes, directly under the chief, directly under him was 12 chiefs. And under each chief, you had clans or family groupings, and then under that you had the fathers of the household. I'm telling you, I believe it's Joshua 5 or 7 that really brings that out, how they called the heads of the tribes, and they just honed it down to each family that way. So the order was elder to chief to clan to father of the house, and under the father was the wife and the children. And the father ruled with a rod of iron. They didn't have a king over them. They worked together, and they consulted together, and they made decisions as one body. But suddenly here in Exodus, something changed, right? Everything's good, things great, learning a lot, nice place to be, man, glad we came. Suddenly something changed. Verse 8, now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Now, who was this cat? Now, in verse 11, it tells us, therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. Now, you know, we got history and archaeology that tells us, I mean, they found these cities and they've excavated them, and so they know who was Pharaoh when these cities were built. And at this time, it begins with a Pharaoh. I won't say his name right, but this Pharaoh at this time is Sethos. And he's also called Satos or Seti. Now the cities were completed by Ramses II, all in about the year of 1304, 05 BC. Sethos was the Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. And he's the one that began the building program and the slavery and brought in the Hebrews. And his son Ramses is the one who completed the program. And Ramses II is probably the one during the plagues. Because you've got to remember, they were there 400 some years, 430 years. So Sethos started his building program, and he used thousands and thousands of Hebrew slaves, all under the burning sun, and he raised cities and temples and monuments. I mean, you could get that on what they call it, papyri, where they wrote that stuff. On one of the writings of the papyri, it says this: the arms of the slaves are utterly worn out. The food of the slaves is a mixture of all things vile. He is allowed to wash himself once a season. He has to drag for a month a huge 17-foot by 10-foot block over soft, yielding soil. Get the picture here? How their culture abruptly changed when this Pharaoh came in. Remember I told you, everything was good, but the priest of Egypt, Pharaoh, God. So what about these two cities here, Pithom and Ramses? Another name for Pithom is the word Succoth. And I can just go right to Exodus 13:20 and show you. And they took their journey from Succoth and encamped at Etham in the edge of the wilderness. This is where they are in Goshen, and Pithom is a city right there, and you know, so they're there. And you know the name Succoth means booths. We get from our Feast of Tabernacles. Pithom to the Egyptians, that was its religious name. Succoth was its civil name. And it was a big store chamber. They was, you could go look at some of the buildings at Pithom, and what you'll see at the bottom of the stones in the building is there's a lot of straw. You remember when he said you're going to make brick but you're not going to get any straw? When they first started out, they got straw. So the bottom of the buildings have a lot of straw in it. You get to the middle part of the building, it's got a little bit of straw. You get to the top, it's got no straw in it. I mean, that's a testimony of history. to what was taking place. Some of the walls in this place are 22 feet thick. Now, Ramses here, this city of Ramses, it was the royal city. It had all the statues and monuments and sphinx and all this other stuff. All these things built by the Hebrew slave. And among these slaves was this little guy. Saw this girl, fell in love with her, married her. His name was Amram. Pronounce that right? So he marries Jochebed. They were both from the tribe of Levi. The Hebrews always gave, you remember me telling you, Hebrew names meant something. They weren't just, like Dances with Wolves, Amram name means kindred of the high and lofty one, which means in plain English, I'm in blood covenant relationship to God. I'm kindred, related. These two had been, and their families had been tainted by the adultery in Egypt. And Jochebed's name means whose glory is Jehovah. So Amram and Jochebed had 2 children. Now the oldest girl, first one they had was Miriam. And Miriam is about 12 years old. Then they have Aaron. Aaron's about 3 years old. So Aaron didn't fall under this edict that was given out by Pharaoh. He didn't come under the command of Sethos, the Pharaoh, when Sethos became afraid of the slave population. I mean, Sethos knew what was going on. Verse 9, he says, they're more and mightier than us. Now think about that. These people could have rebelled at any time. But they didn't. So he makes this edict. Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born, you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Now Egypt had a bunch of gods down there. One of their gods was the river Nile. I mean, to them it was the giver of life. And they worshiped the things in the Nile. They worshiped the crocodiles that was in the Nile. So Pharaoh, in essence, is ordering them to sacrifice their babies to the god of the Nile River, to the gods in the Nile River. I mean, that was what was behind his command. So here Amram and Jochebed, with their 12-year-old Miriam, 3-year-old Aaron, they have another baby. After the command was given to throw all the babies into the river. And they refused to obey this command. But they didn't go around like a bunch of... About 3 months, but it's hard to keep it hid when you're a slave and you got to go to work every day and build the city. Hebrews, I'm going to be going there a lot. Hebrews 11, here in this faith, it says in verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child. And they were not afraid of the king's commandment. They had faith. As I said before, faith is always a response. Faith is not positive thinking. God had said something. They were responding to it. What was it? Nothing was written down. Well, you know, they would pass things on. So, it had been passed on that man was made in God's image. And you remember, God had told him back down there in Genesis. Of course, Moses would be right in Genesis, but these things were passed on about the flood and you know, all of these things. And you remember, no, he told Noah, he wasn't going to take a man's life. You couldn't take a man's life. How wrong it was. Also, they knew that the God they worshiped did not demand human sacrifice. They knew the story of Abraham. They knew Abraham took Isaac up on the hill. And they knew God kept him from slaying his own son. So, telling me that your gods demand human sacrifice, no, we ain't buying it. Acts tells us that this, you know, right here it says a proper, I mean, he was a beautiful child. Proper. He didn't even have a name yet. And when it says he was proper or pretty, it wasn't just cute. Okay, all babies are cute, especially for yours. But he had this spiritual something, this radiance. So they hid him 3 months. But then, you know, they get to where they can't hide him anymore. So they get this idea. Well, all these bulrushes grow up down there. So they took the bulrushes of the Nile, made a little ark, a baby crib, sealed it up with the mud from the Nile River, pitched it with the same pitch that they would use in making the city. And they put this 3-month-old baby in this ark, put him into God's hands, pushed it out into the Nile River. I don't know if you get this, but I just want you to feel what's going on right here. Think if this edict come down when your little baby was born. And the edict was, all the males has got to die. And now you're going to make this ark. And now, I mean, still yet, I can understand the hiding part, but still yet, you got to put your little baby down in this ark and go out into the Nile River. Push that baby out in there. They did exactly what Pharaoh told them to do. Pharaoh hadn't said anything about putting your baby in an ark. He just said put him in the Nile River. So they did exactly what Pharaoh said to do. Psalms 78 tells us that Psalm 78:12, I won't read the scripture, but it was that zone. And this is near Ramses where the royal palace was. Now this is important. Where the royal palace was the only part of the Nile River that didn't have crocodiles. The Nile is infested with crocodiles, but Zone was the royal palace. They kept them out. The reason they kept them out is because it was the royal palace, and it was where this royal family of Pharaoh would go to bathe. And the Nile was a god, so it's where they would come together. So you can't have any crocodiles running around there. So you got these slaves building this city nearby as Jochebed pushes the ark out. And you guys know the story. Miriam, the little 12-year-old, now she's 12. She's hiding in the bulrushes and watching. Now, I want you to get what else going on here? Pharaoh, remember his name is Sethos. Ramses at the time is a little bitty newborn baby himself. Now they would have two thrones because he would be sitting on the throne beside of his father because he was a deity in himself. He's co-ruler. When they had a male, he was co-ruler, right? Even though he's a little bitty baby, can't even talk. Now remember, the family was divine and to the Egyptians. So deity can only marry deity. So from birth, Ramses, the little baby Ramses, was given a wife. And in many cases, it was their own sister, because they can't go outside of the family. So where else are they going to go? They can't go down to the bar, pick up a wife, come right out of their own family. They would have many wives, but a lot of them would be their own sisters. They were all related. One of his wives, probably his sister, was called Thermosis. So she comes down to the river. Jochebed's over here. She just pushed the ark out. Happens to be at the same time that Thermosis comes down to the river. She's married to a little bitty baby who's sitting on the throne. So you get this picture? She has to wait for him to grow up. She comes for a religious ceremonial bath to worship her god Nile. And here comes this drifty little ark of bulrushes with a baby crying in it. Now listen, she knew what was going on. It was very obvious this was a Hebrew baby. She knew what Sethos the Pharaoh had said, but she was a woman. She couldn't just turn that ark over and let that baby drown. You know what I mean? But not only that, she was a member of the priest. According to her religion, after she would die, she would face 42 judges. You know, I mean, you hear all these crazy things go on in the Middle East, you know. And one of the judges that she would face, according to their religion, now listen to this. This is so good. One of the judges that she would face, his name was the Lord of Truth. I mean, that just blows my mind. You can get this in history. She had to memorize what she would say. You know how it's like you're going in before this judge, here's, you know, the lawyer saying, here's what I want you to say. So they would memorize what they were going to say. And it's in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, what they had to say to their gods. I mean, you can Google it and see it. Here's what she would say: I have afflicted no man. I have not made any man weep. I have not withheld milk from the mouth of a suckling child. Now, could you imagine? She's been memorizing this. Here comes this little baby floating down the Nile River. The very God that she worshiped. So to her, it was her God was giving her a gift. So she took that little baby out of the water, named him Moses. And that's what Moses' name means. I drew him out of the water. She sees Miriam over there, the little Hebrew, and she tells Miriam to go back and find a nurse, a Hebrew nurse, to nurse this very baby. Because she knew it was she knew this was a Hebrew baby. So where do you think Miriam goes? Right back to Jochebed, her own mom. And Jochebed is brought into the royal palace, and now she's paid out of the royal purse to nurse her own baby. God is amazing, isn't he?
Yes.
He's amazing. So let's look at this education for a prince Moses, the prince of Egypt. Moses, now that he becomes Pharaoh's daughter, he's prince. Right? He's in line for this Pharaoh seat. Their training began at 4 years old. I wonder what happened the first 4 years. Now, I can't prove this. But Jochebed was Moses' mother who always nursed him. What do you think she would be telling him of the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Noah? And all of these very things that Moses would go on and write called the book of Genesis. Because they had it in this hand-me-down. They couldn't write. So Moses and Ramses, they're about the same age. So they're educated together. And if Ramses doesn't take the throne, if something happens to him, Moses is the guy that will be sitting on the throne of Egypt. I mean, it says in Acts that Moses was taught in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And isn't it funny? You know Psalm 2, why do the heathen rage? And then it says God that sits in the heavens will laugh. Santhos ends up training and educating the very guy that's going to be the downfall of the Egyptians. The providence of God, training him in his own house. And isn't this something? The very method that Pharaoh used to destroy the Israelites would be the very method God used to destroy the Egyptians. Because he told them, throw them in the water. He said, all right, you want some water? I'll give you some water. A little thing called the Red Sea. You throw my children in there, now you'll die the same way. Actually, the very method that you're using to kill those babies will destroy you, for out of those waters will come the deliverer. Out of those waters. Now, this palace that Moses is raised up in, it's a palace of Zon, Z-O-A-N. There's all these, it's like a small town. I mean, they got 100 gardeners there working all the time. High walls and canals, guards everywhere. They got carpets and couches made of peacock feathers and draperies from around the world. And Moses was raised a member of the royal family. He was accepted as a member of the priests because he's in that family, right? Now listen to this. As part of his final education, right, his final college degree, and this is not in the Bible, but his final education for would-be pharaohs was to send him to the temple of the sun. And there they were taught the secret knowledge that no other Egyptians could know but Pharaoh's family. You know what the secret knowledge was? There was only one God. Yeah. It amazes me what else is going on here. But in Moses' training, he's taught politics, math, geometry, astronomy, physics, anatomy, pathology, therapeutics. He wasn't ignorant. And the stuff that the Egyptians taught was so advanced that 1,500 years later, the Greeks would adopt it and it would become the foundation of their education system. Right? So, I mean, you know, Moses learned languages. He had access to libraries. One of the libraries, they said, had 20,000 books. I mean, this is in 1300 BC. Legend says We don't have history for this, but legend says that Moses became a great general, led Egypt to conquer Ethiopia. That's just legend. But Moses knew who he was. He was a Hebrew. His mom taught him he had certain faith in the covenant of God. So much so that at 40, he joined Israel. I mean, he's next in line to the throne. If he got that throne, he would be the most powerful man in the world. And he gave it all up to be a slave? That sounds stupid. Let me go back over here to Hebrews. Verse 11 and 24. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasure of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, where he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. In light of all the wisdom, all the training, all the superior education that Moses had, he refused. He made a choice. Why would he do that? If it was just about delivering the people, he could have done that as Pharaoh. Been a lot easier, wouldn't it? He could have waited, sat on the throne of Pharaoh, it could have been Pharaoh Moses. He could have said, Hebrews, you're it. Everybody had to. So if it was just about delivering the people, I say what Moses did was stupid. But there was more to it. Scripture tells me, and I just read it to you, it was for the sake of Christ. What did Moses know of Christ? Look, I mean, Moses had faith in Christ. Christ hadn't even come yet. Right? I mean, they didn't know nothing about Christ. What was Moses' hope? What was his hope? I mean, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. And it says, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. I mean, here's Moses by faith committing himself to the people who believed in the deliverer of Genesis 3 that had been handed down, right? There's one coming. That Bruce said, there's one coming. They believed that through that deliverer would be born of the seed of Abraham, of who he is through whom all the nations would be blessed, and whom would be the Christ, the anointed one. And he was committing himself by faith to Shiloh, to the stories of the scepter shall not depart till Shiloh come, or till he whose right it is comes. Now look, Hebrews 11:13 says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were persuaded of them, embraced them, confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims in the earth. These all died in faith includes Moses. He saw the promise, and he welcomed it, and abandoned himself. Everything that Moses had in the world, he gave up. He died without ever seeing Christ. That sounds so pitiful, don't it? Can you imagine that? He died without ever seeing Christ, but yet he embraced it. Now see, that's why those guys look forward to our day. I mean, Paul got up and said, would it please God, who separated me from my mother's womb, to reveal his Son in me? Paul said, I've seen him. But his faith grabbed a hold of it. Remember it says right here in verse 39, all these having obtained a good report. How? Through faith. Receive not the promise. I can say this, when did Moses finally receive the promise? When did Moses finally receive Christ? Because I grew up in a religion that says Moses ain't received him yet. Moses ain't saw him yet. But I'm telling you, Moses has. When did that take place? When Jesus rose up from the dead. When he got up out of the grave, Moses got up with him, just like you and me. Then Moses got what he left the palace for. Remember, they received the promise. What was the promise? Paul said the promise through Abraham was the gift of the Holy Spirit. See, Moses, let me break this down just a little bit, and we'll be done here in a minute. Moses knew that through him would come the deliverance of Israel. Through him, as a slave, to deliver slaves. But there was a problem here. There was trouble. He had heard from God, right? He knew this. But he didn't know God. He didn't know God's way. And I'm telling you what, guys, when I studied this out, it was a great revelation to me in this fact because of the very thing that I've been dealing with about unity and all of those things. Moses is trained in Egyptian learning, right? The best schools, top of the line. So Moses' way of rallying the people would be to put up a standard. Let's call them together and let's overthrow. Let's overthrow the palace. I mean, we can do this. There's more of us, right? So Moses does what the wise decision maker would do. Takes matters into his own hand. He sees an Egyptian afflicting a Hebrew, kills him. He sees the injustice. And now Moses is thinking, I've got a rallying point now. They've seen how I will protect them. They've seen how I will fight for them. Now they're going to rally around me. And now I can start this rebellion, this revolution, and we can take over this place. They won't be, Moses thinking, I got this thing going on. But see, Moses had a freedom mentality. Remember I told you the Israelites never were in chains, but they had a slave's mentality. Moses has a mentality of liberty. Israel has a mentality of slavery. They could only think in terms of slavery. Remember, they could leave at any time. They were more numerous. That's why they were throwing them in the river. They could have taken over Egypt at any time. But they didn't. Slaves' mentality. The slaves didn't understand what Moses understood. And now we got an even greater trouble. Now the Israelites, I guess they used to think, man, Moses, he left all that to come and be with us. Man, this is great. And now they're scared of it. Now they say, man, who made you judge and lawgiver over us? So that was their mentality. And Moses has got another trouble, double jeopardy, if you will. See, he killed an Egyptian and buried him in the sand. See, that was a double trouble. Why was it a double trouble? Crime number one was he killed a man. Crime number two was, what do we get from Egypt? Mummies. in the Egyptian religion, if you wasn't a mummy, you couldn't go to heaven. So Moses just robbed this guy, an Egyptian, from going to heaven. And also it meant to Sethos, the Pharaoh, that Moses is a rebel. And now, only two things to do, and that's to send Moses. He'd be banished to the mines, which was out into the middle of the desert, in the mountains, or he'd be killed. So in utter despair of his life, his entire life had fallen to pieces around him, Moses flees into the wilderness. And there's where we will find Moses next week.